As usual, I want to start by just taking us to God's word as we begin. And I'd like to take us to James chapter 4, verses 13 to 17. So James 4, 13 to 17. There James writes this: "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them." I'd already planned to speak on these kind of verses yesterday, and the government announcement in the middle of the night that you do not know what's going to happen tomorrow kind of make them, in some sense, even more pertinent. My daughter got a notification on her phone about that from the university she's going to, and sort of a quarter past midnight was in worrying what the implications would be for her there. So it seems especially pertinent. But I think that the whole coronavirus crisis has brought home for us as church leaders the difficulties of planning. As leaders, as we plan, what we long for is we long for certainty and we long for control. But the reality is that the coronavirus has taught us that we have uncertainty and that we lack control. I've been amazed at the church leaders who express immense certainty about the virus. They're absolutely confident about it, about what it does, about how dangerous it is, and about what government policy ought to be. But it seems to me that the reality is we have an immense amount of uncertainty that affects our ability to plan. And I've been surprised at those who think that if we simply speak to government or protest to government or tell government what it ought to do, that government will listen to us simply because we're churches. We think we're powerful. We think we can influence what happens. And yet the reality is we're relatively small. We're only a minor voice. And so James is really helpful to us as leaders as we think about this whole challenge of planning and leading. It warns us of having a certainty and a confidence that we are in control is a kind of arrogance. And so James 4 really tells us to do two things as we lead. Firstly, it encourages us to accept uncertainty and impotence, to recognize that we don't know and that we are not in control. That's a reminder to us that our planning has to be flexible, that things won't necessarily work out the way that we plan, that we might be surprised by what happens at very short notice. Rather than trying to assert certainty and control, James encourages us to recognize our uncertainty and our impotence, our lack of power. We are not sovereign. And you might think that the conclusion of that is therefore to actually have a counsel of despair and to think that we shouldn't plan at all. But that's not what James says. No, he urges us instead to plan, therefore, with humility and faith in God's sovereignty, with a humble recognition that we don't know and that things might change. We might make good plans, but those plans are subject to the will of God. And that ought to be a comfort to us, because the will of God will be done. So even though things may seem uncertain to us, they are certain to God. Even though we may feel impotent, God is omnipotent. And that means that we can be confident that his purposes will be accomplished. So we need to be those who plan with humility, but who also have faith in God's sovereignty. And I think that will help us to avoid the dangers of arrogance and boasting, but also give us a confidence to be able before God by prayer to make sensible plans, which we know may have to change, but we can be confident that God will accomplish his purpose. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, forgive us that so often we are prone to arrogance and boasting because we think we can be certain and we think we are in control. Please help us instead to recognize the reality that we're not in control and that we don't know. But we ask and pray that even though that's the case, we would be those who plan wisely, with humility and trusting in your good sovereign purposes. May you teach us this lesson through this coronavirus crisis, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. And of course, those principles are true, although they're highlighted by the coronavirus crisis. They're actually true for us at all times. Well, what I want to do is just very briefly remind us of the current guidance for churches in this coronavirus crisis. I'm very conscious here, I'm speaking about the situation in England. In the resources that we've put together, I've also linked to summaries of the slightly different situation in Wales and in Scotland. But this is going to be an overview of where the current situation is in England. Much of this you will know already, but I think it's helpful just for us to be reminded of what the current situation is. So firstly, just in general terms of the guidance and where we're at, it's important to differentiate that there's a difference between law and guidance. In other words, what's legally required and what is guidance. In other words, it's advice that we are advised to follow. Actually, there's relatively little in the way of law at the moment. The wearing of face coverings in churches is a matter of law. Much of the rest is a matter of advice, although it's clear that the rules the government are proposing about maximum gatherings of 6 people will be a matter of law. But the mere fact of something being guidance doesn't necessarily mean it can be simply ignored or set aside. One of the things that's happening at the moment, because of the gradual increase in virus numbers and cases and fears about a second wave, is that there is increased enforcement by the police of the kind of rules on gathering and social distancing. In some contexts, pubs and restaurants have been closed because they haven't been observing the principles of social distancing. There's been an increase in the number of fines being given to organisers of gatherings more than 30 and fines of attenders who attended those gatherings. And the noises coming from the government are an emphasis on increased enforcement. Now, the guidance isn't enforced by the police directly, but there is enforcement under health and safety legislation. So churches and trustees have a duty to have a risk assessment and to seek to ensure that their premises are COVID safe. So although there's not a direct criminal enforceability, there is an enforcement under health and safety legislation, and failure to have a risk assessment and failure to implement measures to ensure that the premises are COVID safe could constitute a criminal offence. So there is indirect enforcement through the health and safety legislation. And that means to say that where there is guidance or strong advice that's given, it's quite difficult to evade and ignore that, because you'd have to write a risk assessment saying that you don't believe there's a risk in these circumstances, and that would very likely not satisfy the health and safety requirements. So we've mentioned before, there are also insurance implications for churches. If you're failing to follow your obligations under health and safety legislation and the guidance, that may well have implications for insurance. And again, you know this already, but in relation to the guidance, key issues for basically all of our activities are the need to undertake a risk assessment, to observe appropriate hygiene, and to keep records for 3 weeks of those who attend for test and trace purposes. I picked up today that the government is going to make it a legal duty for pubs and restaurants to keep the details of those who attend for test and trace. It will become a matter of law. It remains to be seen whether or not that will be extended to churches, but that is certainly a possibility. What about social distancing then for kind of our purposes at this point? Well, the basic social distancing rules are that in England, you're able to socialise indoors with the maximum of members of 2 households. So 2 households can meet indoors, and then socialising outdoors, you're able to gather with a maximum of 6 people from more than 2 households. So slightly different indoors and outdoors. The rules have changed as a result of the government's announcement today. You'll remember that there were sort of no limits on kind of gatherings of people from households up to a maximum of 30 indoors and outdoors if it was 2 households, but that has gone with a simple rule that's going to be introduced, that it will be unlawful to socialise with more than 6 people indoors or outdoors. So both of those provisions about socialising indoors and outdoors will be subject to a limit of 6 people gathering. Now, there are clearly going to be some exemptions introduced to that. Government has specifically said education, workplaces, weddings and funerals, and households where there are more than 6 people in the household or in the household bubble. But clearly there's going to be a desire to want to enforce this new rule more strictly. There'll be fines of £100 for attending a gathering of more than 6, and that will escalate for repeat offences up to a higher figure. What we don't know yet is exactly what this means for churches and church events. It clearly means that for churches, it won't be possible, for example, to have more than 6 people round in homes for meetings for a meal together from 2 kind of households. It may limit some of what we are already doing. It may limit some of our outside gatherings. It's not yet clear whether or not churches will still be able to organise gatherings outside of more than 30 people on open public spaces. We'll have to wait the clarification of the exact government regulations. In terms of the actual church services themselves and the place of worship, there was confirmation earlier today through the Church of England that says that there won't be any change on the rules for kind of places of worship. So it won't be the case that we'll be limited to having 6 people gathering in churches. Churches won't be regarded as being a social activity in that sense. So we'll still be able to have church services. Now, we won't know exactly what all the implications are until government publishes its sort of framework. We may know a little bit more when the Prime Minister gives a press conference this afternoon at 4 o'clock. But if past occasions have been anything to go by, that won't necessarily give the detail that we'll need, and we'll need to wait until the legislation is fully available. It may well be that one of the implications is that when we gather as church, we'll need to be much more careful about making sure that our groups of households, our groups of 6, are socially distanced from one another. We may need to just be more careful in making sure that there isn't that social interaction between different groups that are coming to attend our church services. So we wait to see exactly what the outcome will be, but we can be clear at this point that it won't affect our sort of worship gatherings as such. What about places of worship and services? Again, to overview where we are there, currently there's no limit on the numbers attending if we maintain social distancing within the congregation, though there's a limit of 30, as we know, on those attending weddings, funerals and life cycle ceremonies. You can attend church at present as a sort of a group of a maximum of 2 households that are coming together. So a group of a maximum of 2 households coming together can come to church as a whole. They don't have to maintain the 2-metre distance from one another when they're in church, but there needs to be social distancing between the different either individuals or groups that come. The guidance is a distancing of 2 metres, or if that's not possible, 1 metre with other mitigations. It remains the case that the government advises that over 70s, because of their particular vulnerability, should stay at home as much as possible. And those who are extremely clinically vulnerable or shielding are advised not to attend places of worship. So that still remains in place. As we know, face coverings in church are required by law for worshippers. There are exemptions for those who are leading the service and participating in the service. There are some exemptions for people who are unable for medical reasons to wear face coverings. There's still a limit on conversation, socializing with those who are outside of the group that's attending. So you shouldn't be socializing and interacting with other individuals and groups that are attending church where there's meant to be social distancing between them. Since we last met, baptism by full immersion has been permitted in churches, so that was a significant change. There are some specific rules about how that ought to be done, saying that only one person should be baptizing and they should only be touching the person on the head to push them under the water, and saying that you're supposed to either wash your hands or sanitize your hands between sort of baptizing different individuals. For in Wales, it's even more strict. You're supposed to empty the baptistry and refill it between different baptisms. But that's the position in relation to baptism by full immersion, and the congregation is to be socially distanced from the baptism. But that's a significant change that means we're able to baptize in our church gatherings. It's still the case that no congregational singing is permitted. The guidance is against congregational singing, although small groups are permitted to sing inside church. So you can have a small group singing in church, maintaining social distancing, protecting the congregation appropriately. Outdoor worship is still permitted on church premises. That's things like car parks, gardens, courtyards. One of the interesting things that we'll watch out for is when this new rule about 6 is brought in, I'm presuming that it will still be possible to do outdoor worship on church premises. I would imagine that will still be covered by the rules relating to a place of worship. I think it is questionable, and we'll have to watch out for this, whether or not churches will be able to organise gatherings for 30 or more on outdoor public space, which is not the church premises. So I think worship outside on the church premises, where it would inevitably be a gathering of more than 30 or 30 plus, will probably be permitted. I think we'll have to wait and see whether that applies to other outdoor public spaces, which might have an implication for churches that have been organising those kinds of gatherings. We'll let you know as soon as we're aware. Places of worship and churches, once they're open, they're not limited to use just for Sunday services. You can use them for other meetings and other gatherings, provided you observe the sort of requirements on social distancing. Government has said that churches can be used for Bible study and prayer meetings, and that within those meetings, interaction as part of what's described as a formal event is acceptable, which includes discussion in Bible studies, sharing prayers at a prayer meeting. Although government has said that where a group gathers together to do that, it must observe social distancing, and those participating must wear face coverings. And it's important that there shouldn't be more people present, so that voices don't need to be raised for all to hear. So the number of people present and participating needs to be not greater than would require voices to be raised from a normal conversational level. I think one of the things we'll need to watch out for is whether or not that will be affected by this kind of limit of 6 people under the new law. We'll have to wait and see exactly what's said. But at the moment, you can use the place of worship for Bible study and prayer meetings. The other area that's obviously significant for many churches as they begin to get going in their ministries is youth and children's ministry. And here it's really difficult to put the guidance together because it's not found within the guidance for places of worship. But the guidance in relation to what we can do with children and youth comes from a combination of other aspects of government guidance, including out-of-school settings, early years and childcare providers, and the community use of buildings. Now, the best advice, taking all of what is in those different guidance documents together, is this. It seems that now creche and toddler groups are able to meet. So because of the rules in relation to early years and childcare providers and community use buildings, it seems that now creche and toddlers groups can meet in church. Although there's a need to maintain social distancing between household groups if parents and carers are present with their children. So if it's only children, there's not the obligation to maintain social distancing. But if parents and carers are with their children, you need to maintain social distancing and no sharing of toys. For groups of children aged under 5, you can have now groups of children aged under 5, and there's no sort of size limit for a group of children aged under 5. Again, the assumption here is they're not with their parents and carers. This is children with the staff and volunteers who are sort of serving them. For children who are over 5, again, you can have groups, but here there's a maximum group of 15, including leaders. So if it's under 5, no limit. If it's over 5, a maximum group of 15, including leaders. And here the object is to, as far as possible, try to keep small, consistent groups that are consistent from week to week with the same children and leaders in the group. For youth and children's ministry, the advice is that face coverings are not required in that context for the children or for the leaders. And you might think this is strange, and I don't make this guidance up, but apparently singing is permitted in children and youth groups, provided that voices are not raised. So children's groups are able to sing, but at the same time, you're not supposed to have live performances of drama, comedy, or music. Also at this point, overnight and residential activities are not permitted. So I hope that gives you a bit of an overview of what the main elements of the guidance are as they apply to churches and church ministry at the moment. The most helpful and comprehensive material produced summarising the guidance and what it means for churches has been produced by the Baptist Union, who have rewritten all of their guidance for church worship and for youth and children's ministry. It is hugely helpful, and I strongly recommend it to you, and I'm very grateful to them for producing it. So the Baptist Union has produced some excellent guidance for churches and about youth and children's ministry. There's also some helpful material available from the Church of England. And we've put together a resource sheet that links to that advice and that also links to all the main government documents that are the sort of material from which that advice has been developed. I've also included on that link specifically to an Evangelical Alliance guide to the position in Wales and to the sort of position in Scotland, which summarises the situation there. So hopefully most of that you know already. There are a few changes that I hope it's been helpful to highlight. As we've seen all along, this is developing and changing, and we will try to keep you updated whenever we get new information from the government, so that you know what you ought to be doing at a local church level. Well, that just sets the context for what it is that we're doing. And against that background, I do think that as we go into the autumn, it's fairly clear that this framework of guidance is the new normal that we're going to have to live with for some time. I think that it's clear that government has indicated that these provisions are going to be in place for the foreseeable future. Social distancing will be reviewed in November. Matt Hancock has indicated that he doesn't think things will change much ahead of Christmas. So this is the reality that we're going to have to live with. There's not going to be some sudden change and back to the way things were before the lockdown in the next few months. And I think that, together with sort of the fact that people feel somewhat refreshed after the summer, and that people feel the greater need to be able to gather together physically as churches, has meant that most churches are now beginning to think about meeting physically. Some have been doing so since they were first allowed to in July. Many have started in these first couple of weeks of September. Others are planning, if they can, to move towards meeting. So what I thought it'd be helpful for us to do is hear from a number of our church leaders about what they're doing in their local church, where they're at, how it's working out, and any particular challenges that they've faced. Now, I know we've only got a limited period of time, and there's much you'd love to hear from these brothers. We are going to bring in more of the things they hint at today in subsequent webinars and cover them in a bit more detail. But this is really a sort of a taster, just to give you a sense of the range of what's happening across FIEC and how different churches are approaching these challenges. So first of all, it would be great if Steve Kneale. Steve, do you want to come in and just tell us a little bit about what's happening at Bethel in Oldham?
Yeah, so first thing I'd say is, based on what's come out today, you can all chill out a bit, because we've had 6 weeks worth of even harder, more stringent lockdown measures than that. So we're not allowed to socialise with anybody at all outside of our household groups in any number whatsoever, anywhere, indoors or outdoors. So that's kind of our situation locally. In terms of our meeting in the church, we started meeting again as soon as we were allowed to do that. And we carried on live streaming what we were doing from the church. But we had a shift away from the live stream. So when we were live streaming from homes, obviously everybody was tuning into the live stream then. As soon as we were back in our building on any level at all, we basically had a shift in our mindset and said, we're going to try and be as inclusive of things that we can do as possible. So as soon as we could do communion, we did that. As soon as we could do other things, we've done those things. We've moved from mainly having the live stream to basically having meetings for the people who are in the room. And the people who are live streaming, we're very clear on the live stream. We're glad they're watching. We're glad they're able to see what's happening. But ultimately, what's happening is for those who have been able to gather that week. In terms of the social distancing and things like that, it's the same as for everybody really. So we've got chairs spaced out in different banks and things like that around the church. We don't have a booking system because the nature of our folks, it just wouldn't work. So we generally have our doors open from about 10:10 through to about 10:25. So we have a 15-minute intake where we bring people into the building, and then about 25 we lock the doors and we start the live stream, and we basically tell people who come after that time that they're going to have to live stream from home. And yeah, the only thing we're not really doing at the moment is we're not singing. So obviously congregational singing is not permitted. I know different folks have tried different ways. Our view on that's generally been, until we can actually sing as a congregation, which is what matters, we've decided not to do that. But otherwise, we're pretty well doing everything else that we would usually do in our service.
Steve, just what size is your usual congregation, and how many of those are coming to your kind of physical gatherings?
Yeah, so normally on a Sunday, we'd probably see 50 or so people, including children. With the distancing, we're seeing somewhere around 15 to 20 people in the building. And then on the live stream, it ranges from, we could have 30 people streaming in, we could have, or households rather, or we've had up to 100 and 150 people streaming in. So we've got a much bigger reach on our live stream than we had otherwise.
Great, Steve, thank you very much. Paul, can I come to you? Paul Gamston at South Craven. Do you want to tell us where you're at in your planning and thinking?
Thank you. It's nice to continue my ministry as FIEC's favourite failure. Thank you for encouragements for my last stuttering appearance. We're not meeting. We have tried to take a little bit of time. Our object's not to try and get back in the building room. It's to try and think through how can we best be the church in our current circumstances. So we surveyed the church, explaining what a return to the building might look like, and asking folks what they felt would be the pros or cons of doing that. It's quite clear that a very small percentage of the church would feel it worthwhile going back to the building, and that the majority of the church feel that we can best be the church online at the moment. But that as leaders, we feel very strongly that for the sake of the small minority who feel for whom it will be important to get back in the building, we want to try and work out how to do a hybrid. Taking a little bit of time to preach through Romans 13 as to why we're following government guidelines, Romans 14 and 15 about how we maintain our relationships together as a church family. We tried to spend some time thinking through what is the church and what are we trying to achieve here in a midweek meeting. That was hard conceptually. We set the first breakout rooms open. I had a phone call from downstairs from my household saying, we've got no idea what you're talking about. So that didn't go quite as well as I was hoping. We were hoping then to start trialing on a Sunday evening, having a few people in the building, but our internet speed isn't up to whack, so we've got to get that sorted. We've managed to bust the camera on the first trial as well, so we've got to wait for that to get processed. And the lighting in the building isn't good enough, so we probably have to repaint the back wall and move lights and all the rest of it. So that's not happening quickly. If I'm honest, at the moment, my head is hurting. We've got some people in local lockdown, some not. I had an email from someone this morning saying, can we do this in our life group, trying to help people? I'm just looking at the guidelines and the paragraphs thinking, I just can't get my head around with this. And with the latest changes, that's just added into all of that. At the same time, God's at work. I think we genuinely feel as a church that we're together at the moment. There's a really good spirit. There is a lot of patience and a lot of love happening. We've added 4 members in the last couple of months. Someone's just come to faith through Online Christianity Explored. So that's kind of where we're up to. We're just not meeting together yet in the building. That may well come in maybe October by the time we've got all the other practical things sorted out. So that's where we're up to.
What sort of size is the congregation?
Well, we're slightly complicated because we have a plant congregation in Keighley. They'd be about 20-25. They meet in a hired building, which is not reopened yet. Back at base, we'd be somewhere around probably an average of 55. We're averaging about 80 across the 2 congregations online at the moment. That could be up to 100. We've got people, we meet on Zoom in our 2 Sunday morning congregations separately. We're all together in the evening. We're also live streaming to YouTube, which picks up extras. So yeah, that's the kind of size we are.
Great. Spencer, can I come to you? Emmanuel, Chippenham. You need to unmute.
Sorry, yeah, sure. Briefly, we've been online on YouTube actually since lockdown happened. First pre-recorded, and then we moved in mid-July to live streaming from our building, deliberately, really, to allow other preachers to preach more easily. And not just me and a colleague, but also to allow the possibility for holiday and facilitate our going back. We were all geared up to go back, and then they made clear that we weren't allowed to talk to each other. And to be honest, mid-July, I and my fellow leaders were just exhausted, and we kind of looked at one another and said, let's just pause here. So we did that, and we've continued live streaming, but we haven't had the congregation go back yet, despite all our pre-planning. During August, I managed a couple of weeks, a couple of Sundays while we were on holiday in Cornwall, and had the lovely experience down there in St Ives of going to a little church run by a friend of mine who may or may not be here today. And although we couldn't talk to people, just the very presence of being with other Christians in the same place, all masked up, was absolutely wonderful. And my family came back and said, Dad, whatever happens, we're going to have to try and get this going, you know. And but we knew that as a church. We've reviewed it in August. I got to say, some of the stakeholders in church were saying to me, but what's changed? And I think my answer to that is, what's changed is that this is obviously going to last a long time. This is the new normal. So we need to get people back. So we've surveyed the church. If everybody turns up on a Sunday, we have between 180, 190 people, if everybody turned up, because that never happens. Of the survey that's come back so far, 70 people would like to come into our building. Socially distanced, we think we can handle just over 40. So we're going to have to start a rota system and just work that through according to people's circumstances. We're aiming to start that this coming Sunday. I think we're really conscious that this is really divisive. It's divided between those who can't come because of medical reasons, or won't come because of medical reasons and they're just afraid, and also those who could come but are just quite comfortable not coming, and they're the ones that worry me the most, and those who would like to come, and we just can't fit everybody in. So we want to serve all of those. We're going to continue live streaming now permanently. We've built in the kit so that we can do that. And we're running morning and evening as full services as we can, as interactive, you know, and so on. Everything normal, except we can't sing in the building, and we won't do that. Our aim is to introduce morning services in the next couple of weeks, get comfortable with doing that, people being in the building, rota working. Once we think we've got a proper handle on that, we'll introduce evening services with different chairs for all those COVID secure reasons. And then once that's comfortably going, we're looking at the possibility of introducing some live singing, a small singing group, but that may or may not happen. Our young people's groups are all online. Sunday school is online, and so we're looking at midweek young people's groups possibly starting to meet in the building after half term, if we can make that work with all the COVID security. We've got other evangelism going on online. Life Explored starts next week, God willing. I think the biggest thing though for us is this question of making sure nobody feels left behind. There are those who would love to be there, and it's just really important to them that though they can't come, we don't make them feel like second-class citizens. And no matter what happens, under the current situation, we will never have more than a quarter of the church in the building. So actually, our experience will be that most of the attention will go to the camera, I think, and the folk who are in the building will just have to understand that since 3/4 of the church is joining us on screen, they're the ones who will get the attention.
Spencer, thank you so much. That's been really, really helpful. Can I turn to Adrian, Christchurch Market, Harborough?
It's called Christchurch Harborough now, John. That's all right. We're about 100, 110 if we were all there. Although, of course, a bit like Spencer, any given week, we're not. We haven't done anything yet in person, but this Sunday we're planning to meet for the first time. Like many of the newer churches in the FIEC, we rent a building to move in, so to meet in. We normally rent in one of the schools, but the lettings agency they use has gone bust, and the school has no appetite really or capacity to think about renting a building out to us. So wonderfully, in God's providence, we have found a new venue, which is this one you can see on the screen, which is Harborough Congregational Church, small liberal church, but once was much larger, as you can see from its size. Pastor one Philip Doddridge in the past, and they have a hall round the back. The pictures you can see on the right are actually the hall round the back, not the main meeting hall, which would normally seat 150. We can get 60 seats in there, socially distant. So we're going to try it out this Sunday, just as a one-off really. We've booked it for once a month. Our approach is basically slow and steady. We know we can do Sunday mornings. We've got that kind of down to a fine art, if you like, as much as possible. So we want to go slow and steady. So we're going to try meeting here on Sunday. It's basically a double whammy for us, because not only are we having to incorporate all the COVID restrictions, but it's a new venue at a new time. We normally meet in the morning. We're going to have to meet in the afternoon so we don't clash with the existing congregational church. So it feels like sort of, double the amount of work, double the amount of kind of head space that you need just to get your head around what's going on. We're going to do an all-age service. We're not doing small groups for kids. So it's an all-age service. And we're going to say, actually, we've only got 60 spaces, so we're going to say we especially want families with young children to come. The reason for that is we think they're the ones who have missed out most over lockdown. So I think in terms of the people who are most stressed in church, they tend to be working parents with kids who have had to school their children and do their jobs working from home. And so we wanted to acknowledge that, really. They've missed out on Sunday school. They've missed out on youth group. As much as we like to think children are taught at home by their parents, and that's the primary teaching, of course we do think that's very important. We know actually a lot of parents rely on the teaching their kids get through the church. So that's why we've gone for an all-age service. And our all-age specialist, Jonathan R. Prime, is going to be preaching on Sunday. We're going to use some musicians. We've got some transparent screens to sing behind. We're going to try humming. We'll see how we get on.
Great, thanks so much, Adrian. Can I go to Richard at Woodgreen, Evangelical Church?
Yeah, hi. So our situation is we've got a large building and a car park. Pre-lockdown, we had 2 morning services and an evening service. Since lockdown, we've premiered a pre-recorded morning service on YouTube as our main Sunday service. But in August, we trialled 4 Sunday evening meetings in our building that were also live streamed for people to watch at home. We did a survey of people after this to see how they got on with it. And about the only thing that was clear was how unclear everyone is about what we should do next. And some people want to return to in-person services. Other people are very nervous or unsure and quite unenthusiastic. We've taken the view as leaders that we need to move in this direction because of the opportunity. We need to be more intentional about that, but we need to do it slowly and carefully, taking people with us. So we've targeted the 1st of November to move our main Sunday services back into our building. and we're planning to run 2 morning services, changing the chairs over in between, as Spencer's mentioned, one of which will be live streamed for those who can't or don't want to come. And until then, we're going to continue with our pre-recorded morning services and run another series of live streamed Sunday evening meetings just to get us used to that. Now, it's worth saying we realise a lot can change before the 1st of November, and it's a risk to wait that long. But I think 2 main issues have driven that delayed start date for us. The first issue is the importance of maintaining a sense that we're one church family. Again, Spencer has already mentioned this, and this has been a big issue for us. I think one of the dangers of restarting physical services, which gets greater the longer that season goes on, is that we end up with a sense that we're divided as a church family into the can comes and the can't comes. That's particularly significant in our context here, because even if we maxed out both Sunday morning services, the reduced capacity of our building would mean that the majority will still be watching from home. Now, that issue becomes a problem if the can't comes start to feel that the can comes are getting preferential treatment and access, and that they're forgotten about or reduced to the role of spectators. So we've come up with a couple of ways of dealing with that, and there will be others, I'm sure, as well. First of all, it means that our live stream has to be as good as possible so that those watching from home get a good experience. That's where we've hit a snag. Like Paul, we've had problems with our live streaming and intermittent upload speeds. It means the quality of the picture is sometimes rubbish and it's been at risk of failing. So we've said that we can't really move forward with moving back into our building until we can guarantee the live stream will be reliable. But that issue of maintaining a sense of being one church family is also going to shape the way that we do live services when we eventually restart. So we're anticipating that our live services will contain a mixture of live and video content. The preaching and leading will be live. Our music group are gearing up to play and to sing live. But we anticipate that some elements of the service, such as the children's talk or the Bible reading or the prayers, maybe even some of the music, will continue to be videos. Not only because that works better for those watching at home, but also because it means we can continue to feature each week some of those who can't come. So that the 50-year-old lady who's in the high-risk category and would love to be with us but doesn't feel able can still do the Bible reading or lead us in prayer, and therefore be a visible part of what's going on. So one of the key things we're trying to think through is how to minimize, as far as is possible, the divide between the can comes and the can't comes, and blur that line as much as possible. And I think that means asking the can comes to make some sacrifices in order to be as inclusive as possible of the can't comes. I think that's what loving one another looks like in this season and in this context. So that issue of maintaining one church family is one that we're continuing to think through carefully. The second issue, which I'll just mention briefly, is that as we've started to planning to restart, we've realised the challenge of re-recruiting people to serve for a whole host of reasons, many understandable. We're discovering people are reticent to start returning to serve in ministries they were involved in pre-lockdown. Some people are very nervous about the virus. Other people are looking at uncertain job prospects and are feeling they need to prioritise going into the office, and are worried that if they get involved in serving in a church team, they might become a victim of NHS track and trace. And then there are some, as has already been mentioned, who are just exhausted by everything and have got out of the habit of serving, all of which means the restart of church ministries, we don't think, can be rushed. We want to encourage people to get back into the habit of serving, but we've realised we need to be careful not to pile on the guilt, and to do that gently and pastorally and in an understanding way. And if that means we have to take longer to restart our church programmes and church services, we think that's okay. I would rather not rush the process and shepherd people well through this next period than push people too hard and lose them and not be a good shepherd in that sense. So that's our situation.
Thanks, Richard. And lastly, Mark at Christchurch, Dunstable.
Yes, hello everyone. Yeah, that's very helpful what Richard has shared, and that really resonates with me. We've now moved to the situation where we're running 4 services on a Sunday, but that has been quite incremental. We've tried to incrementally make changes each month. So we started in July with just 1 service in July the 5th. As we moved forward, we went to 2 services in the morning. We had a holiday Bible club that was run 2 weeks ago. Needed to start a 3rd service there, a second family service effectively for some of the families who come there. And then last Sunday, the first Sunday in September, we've moved to starting a 4th service, which is a second sermon series, which was also a baptismal service. And we baptised 3 people in line with the government suggested guidelines of how to do that. We did that exactly, and it worked fine. Got people to kneel in the pool, 1 person in the pool with them just gently pushing their head down with warning, and it was fine. By the time the first person was baptised, this is the new way we do it, and that worked well. We would normally expect around 550 people to come through the doors of the church pre-lockdown on a Sunday. What's happening at the moment is we would have just a little over 300 coming through on 4 services. I think some observations that I would make, John. Oh, let me just say as well, we've now had some live singing from the front, which has been a significant development from having recorded singing projected. And I think one of my observations would be for those churches that are just beginning this whole process, it does take time for the new normal to become normal. Some of you will relate to that. So what seems strange with wearing a mask or having a recorded music from the screen or having live singing, it all seems strange for the first time or 2, but very quickly, I know it is a hackneyed phrase, but it is an important one. It does become the new normal very quickly and people relax. A few general comments. It goes without saying that change is the new normal, but I think we have had to learn as a pastoral team and a leadership to cope with change. Even though we're trying to increment our changes month on month, there is a sense of we're living with change far more. We all know that, but that is tiring. And I think we are having to make sure we encourage one another to keep going through this and to keep the changes coming. So we're examining starting children's work and youth work. That's all being risk assessed at the moment. And we hope to be able to roll that out in the weeks ahead. And I think it takes a lot of encouragement with leaders to keep changing and recognising this is going to continue. We are having to absorb anxiety from some in the congregation and to listen carefully. And I think we're growing in doing that and learning to do that better. We have been quite struck that when we do lay things on, having thoughtfully allowed it to be properly, of course, risk assessed and rolled out carefully, people do come back. So it's almost like replanting your own congregations. And it's been quite encouraging that as people come, so they then talk and say, hey, I really enjoyed it, why don't you come too? And the congregation does grow steadily, including we're discovering people now coming twice on a Sunday to one of the morning services and then to the evening service. What I would say is I have a pastoral conviction with the team that we want to see people back face to face. And that's good. I think online has been great at helping sustain the church. I think face-to-face actually helps grow the church. But we are trying to be really sensitive in the way Richard said, and I think we have to keep growing in this to understand why some people don't come back. I have found Anthony Barraclough's, that's Anthony Barraclough from St Matthew's, West Pymble in Australia. He's done a very helpful YouTube video on heart, head or health. Why aren't they coming and how to pastor and challenge. And I have found that incredibly helpful. Heart, head or health, why aren't they coming, how to pastor and challenge. Working through whether the reason some aren't coming back is because of real health reasons or because of anxiety, what he calls head for his memorable headings, whether people are having real anxieties and we need to pastor them with, work those things through, or whether it is heart reasons. People are preferring what he calls something like sofa church or coffee church at home. I feel he's very sensitive in that, and I think we're having to work that through and explore it because, as Richard said so clearly and others have mentioned, we want to see the church united. We want to see as many as possible united within the church. But of course, we are continuing to stream as well. We found trying to put the camera somewhere discreet helps us as pastors and the church not to feel it's just a studio congregation, but rather this is the locus. But we do want to include everyone at home, even though we'd love to see as many as possible continuing to join us. So I think those are some of the learning points we've made. I think that's the broad outline of what is happening for us. And we continue to pray for all of you at different stages. I have to say it's been encouraging for us seeing some other smaller local churches opening up their services too. The small evangelical church, the smaller evangelical church across the road, it's not small, the smaller one across the road is now running 4 services. And a very small church with just 20 people near us has been running for the last 2 or 3 months with just obviously a small fraction of the 20. And we just try to mutually encourage each other, as I'm sure so many of you are doing within towns or villages, and pray for each other through all of this. So I hope that's helpful anyway in outline.
Mark, I'm right in your services, some are family services and some are kind of not family services?
Yeah, we have family services at 9:15 and now 3:15. And then we have, and that's intended for people up to the age of 14 with parents. And then we have services for the rest of the congregation from 11 upwards. So there's a deliberate overlap for 11 to 14s. They can choose which to come to, or come to both if they want to. So that's worked quite well for us.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing what's happening in your situation, for so many helpful observations and just kind of charting the different places that you're in. I hope that's been helpful to all of you, irrespective of where you are on this journey at the moment, to just sort of, in a sense, think about what could be done, the direction you might be heading in, the things to be aware of as you undertake that journey as leaders and as leadership teams and congregations. Phil, let's go to questions. You're moderating. Do you want to kick us off? Let's see how many we can deal with.
Thanks, John. I think it's worth saying at this point, it might be worth you and I recording questions extra. We won't get through them all. So okay. Just managing expectations there. There's been lots and lots of them. A few coming in about face masks, John. When people are talking about 2 meters versus 1 meter, is a face mask classed as a mitigation to drop to 1 meter plus? If not, what might those mitigations be? People are talking about allowing more people in, doubling up basically with 1 meter plus. What advice would you give all around that kind of thing?
It's been clear all along that a face mask is not regarded as a mitigation to go from 2 meters to 1 meter in and of itself. The face mask is a legal obligation that you have to wear in a place of worship. It is not a justification for cutting that 2 meter distancing between different household groups. The way the guidance is phrased is you should have 2 meters unless that is not possible. If you have to go to 1 meter, then other mitigations that are suggested include things like hand washing, ventilation, and screens as ways of justifying moving to 1 meter. So face masks in and of themselves are not under the guidance regarded as being sufficient to justify a smaller scope. The challenge here really is the numbers of people you can get in your building. And I know the natural inclination is to want to reduce the distancing so you can get even more people in. The legislation is basically, or the guidance is much more along the lines of you determine how many people you can get in by what is possible with the distancing kind of measures. So yeah, that's a brief summary of where the guidance is at.
John, you talked about singing and how small groups can now sing together. Have the government got choirs in mind there especially? How far apart should singers be? What's the difference between a small number singing at the front and congregational singing? A number of questions coming in around that. What would your advice be to churches thinking this through?
And this is a mix of the challenge of regulations that are designed for professional musicians and how that then operates to performance venues and churches. Again, it's sort of the guidance is small groups of singers can sing effectively to the audience of the congregation. So in effect, that's small choirs, small kind of groups. Those singers are meant to be sort of socially distanced and the congregation is protected, just as it would be the case if you had a single singer singing, which was already permitted. So in most cases, that will mean 2 meters plus distance from the congregation, or maybe screening of the singers. The Baptist Union is suggesting, and the church is suggesting that a small group is really no more than 5 people. And I think we've got to be quite careful not to sort of, in a sense, try to use the allowance of small groups of singing to have everybody sing. I was reading some stuff on Twitter today, a leader who was saying, well, if soloists can sing, why can't everybody be a soloist and just all be a soloist together? If we've got a small church, why can't we deem the whole church to be the choir and there are small groups singing together? I think that is clearly contrary to everything the guidance is seeking to accomplish and achieve. So really, it's talking about a congregation gathered with a small group. 5 is the guidance the Baptist Union is giving. That's not a strict rule, but it just reminds us that it's meant to be a small proportion of the body gathered as a whole who are singing for the benefit of the congregation as a whole.
John, I know that we'll get more from the government later with regards to the 6 gathering, that kind of thing. There's a number of questions coming about that. A number of churches had been sensibly dispersing people, then encouraging them to talk socially distanced, say in church car parks or in public places. Is that going to be frowned upon now, do you think? What kind of advice would you give to churches thinking that through in terms of helping their people to connect with one another?
Well, I think what you're describing, I'm not sure they should be doing at the moment. So under the current guidance, if you come to church, you're not supposed to be socially interacting with other groups, other households that have come in any event. So the current guidance is you come as your group, which can be a maximum of 2 households. You socially distance from all other groups in the congregation. You leave quickly. And the guidance is to avoid social interaction with other groupings. So I think it'd be fair to say that the guidance as it's currently constructed would seem to suggest that it isn't something you should be doing in the place of worship or on church premises, like the car park. So I'm not sure that the new provisions are necessarily going to fundamentally change that. What is going to change is it's going to be sort of it's going to be put on the basis of law, and there's clearly going to be a much stronger emphasis on enforcing. Now, this is being driven by pubs and hospitality venues where, again, people should only be sitting in their groups of 6 and not interacting with one another, but that has been being ignored. But increasingly, bars and pubs are being shut down if they're failing to implement those guidelines. That's why it's being put on a legal basis. And one of the objectives of the government is to make it easily enforceable by the police so that you know what a maximum group is. So I think my comment on that would be, it may be that what's being described is already contrary to the guidance. What seems clear is under the new sort of rules that are being brought in, there'll be much stronger kind of enforcement of making sure that those groups of 6 aren't interacting with one another.
Can you just clarify, a couple of people have asked this, John, about sort of 2 households coming to church together. Surely when they arrive at church, those households should in fact remain socially distant, shouldn't they? Because they would have to be if they were in each other's homes. Just could you clarify that? A couple of folk have asked.
I'm not sure it's quite clear under the guidance that if you're meeting in somebody's home, you have to maintain 2 meters distance from everybody else. So the kind of social distancing that you have to observe when you're in somebody else's home isn't quite the same as maintaining the 2 meters from everybody else. So if you look at the social distancing requirements, it's more about hygiene, not sharing toilets, not sharing utensils, the way that you do food. So there's an assumption that when people are in a home together or in a group together, they're not maintaining a 2 meter distance from one another. So I think that the guidance is assuming that when you've come as a kind of households that are together, you are together sort of 2 meters away from everybody else. But it's not the case that within that group, you're required to be 2 meters away from everybody else who is within that group.
Thanks, John. In terms of churches that don't have buildings, a couple of folk have been in touch saying, you know, we did a lot of our ministry in homes. We were just beginning to open that up again. This sort of rule about 6, what's that going to mean for perhaps youth and children's ministry that's taken place in homes, Bible studies, prayer meetings? What clarification might you be able to give on that?
It's clearly going to limit it because the rule will apply to all groups, indoors and outdoors, and it specifically will include children within the measure of the 6. So when Nick Hancock talks about, you know, I've got 3 children and it means therefore they'll only be able in the home to meet 1 grandparent, that gives you a flavour of what's happening and what's intended. Of course, it's not massively different from the current legislation. Outside, it could be a maximum of 2 households or 6 people from different households. Inside, it was a maximum of 2 households. So in actual fact, the only limit is where 2 households would together have meant more than 6 people inside. That's the particular limitation that will come in. So some of the things that churches might have been thinking about doing might well not have been possible under the legislation anyway, under the guidance anyway. They were only supposed to have a maximum of 6 people from more than 2 households outside, and inside it was only 2 households that could gather. But there will be an absolute limit on 6 people in that context under the legislation that the government is going to introduce.
A good question has come in here about life cycle events. Obviously, weddings and funerals would be the most obvious ones for us. Would baptism be classed as a life cycle event, given that most of our churches would do baptism as part of an ordinary worship service? What would you think about that, John?
I'm not sure I necessarily know the answer to that question. I think that's meant to cover all other kind of religious ceremonies like bar mitzvahs, circumcisions. For most of us, baptism will be done within the service. If, of course, you're doing a baptism as a sort of a totally separate standalone thing, then the life cycle events are limited to a maximum of 30 people attending. So quite simply, if you're doing it as part of your service, that overall 30 limit doesn't apply. If you're doing it, say, as a kind of midweek strange time, just a baptism on its own, then it's possible it will be caught by that 30 limit.
John, in terms of test and trace, you mentioned that it's a possibility that churches will have to, by law, hold details for 21 days. What's the outcome likely to be for people who've attended church? If everyone's been socially distanced, does that mean that everybody who was at the church would automatically have to self-isolate if there's a COVID case within the church? Because that's evidently putting some people off coming back. Richard, Lacey mentioned that. What would your advice be on that from what you know about how the government are operating test and trace?
From what the government has said, no, it wouldn't be the case that if there's somebody who is kind of tested and found to have had COVID within the congregation, that everybody in the congregation would have to isolate. That's actually why the social distance provisions are important. In principle, only the group that the person has come with should have to socially isolate. The problem is if there's been socializing between different groups in the church, in other words, groups talking with each other, as we spoke about a moment ago, whether in the service, before the service, on the car park after the service, at that point, those who have socially engaged with the group where a person was infected would also be expected to then have to isolate. So the protection against a wide number of people being required to isolate under test and trace is the maintaining of that social distance between the groups that come to church throughout and before and after the service. So test and trace will catch those who have socially interacted. But where there hasn't been social interaction and distancing has been maintained, then there wouldn't be an expectation of having to isolate.
Thanks, John. A couple of questions coming in about the clarifications on the guidelines with regards to Bible studies and prayer meetings. So previously, acts of worship were very much centered around the Sunday gathering. You mentioned some changes there, which folk have asked for clarification on. So does that mean we can gather for these in church buildings? Can you just reiterate that for folk? Because it's the first time some people have heard it.
I mean, from FIEC, we've been saying from the beginning, once the building is open and you can use the building, you can use it for multiple purposes. It's always been the case that you could do that. The clarifications that I indicated were because the Baptist Union specifically wanted further clarification from the government, and that is the clarification that they were given, enabling you to have Bible studies and prayer meetings with interaction, provided that people wear masks and provided that there's no need to raise the voice above normal conversational levels. The Baptist Union, and we were advising this beforehand, would say that if you need to speak above conversational level, then maybe the way to do it is to not have group discussion, but rather to use a microphone and have participation from the front by people one at a time using amplification. So there are ways in which you can actually have slightly larger prayer meetings or Bible studies, or what the Baptist Union would describe as a kind of more of a Bible lecture, if you use amplification rather than a group discussion format. The bit that's perhaps been clarified by the Baptist Union is that discussing with one another while wearing face masks in the group, provided you don't raise your voice.
I'm conscious of time. I'll do one more question about general church, then if I could do a couple about youth and children's, and then I think we probably have to wrap up then. Final question about how to use the church building. A couple of questions have come in about other meetings, so elders meetings, deacons meetings, trustees meetings. Can they take place in a church building? How should they take place? What guidelines should be followed in that sense?
Yes, they can, because again, it's the building that is open and is open for use. But when you use the building, you have to comply with the requirements on social distancing and face coverings. So it's possible to meet, but once you're meeting in the place of worship, the fact that it's a church business meeting or an elders meeting or a staff meeting doesn't take away from the requirement to wear face coverings in the premises. Of course, actually, it gets slightly more complicated because it's also the case that those who are staff and employees don't have to wear face coverings in the premises. So it's not simple. It kind of depends who's there, but you can use it for those other meetings. But in the end, the guidance, I mean, actually it's law rather than guidance, is that those who are not employees and staff attending those meetings would be required to wear face coverings because it's taking place in the place of worship, which of course is what we just saw in relation to Bible studies and prayer meetings.
So in terms of youth and children's ministry, John, the under fives provision, does that mean churches should feel able to restart creche on a Sunday morning?
That's what's being advised, yes, because the rules in relation to younger children and early years provision have changed as we come out of the summer period. So yes, you can have groups for creche and toddler groups. Again, you've got to comply with the social distancing requirements. Because of the problems of infection, generally there's a feeling that there isn't a risk to children, but there is to adults, which is why the social distancing provisions kick in if you're gathering with parents or guardians, carers who are coming with the children. So social distancing becomes more problematic when you're running a creche that parents come to with their child. If you're running a creche that children are left at, then you've got your staff and volunteers, but you don't have the same social distancing issues because you don't have adults who are there.
Lots of questions still coming in. Forgive me, this will be the last one, just for time reasons, but John and I will record some outside of this. So last one on youth and children's ministry, John. Can the leaders of groups of 15 move around? So what I mean by that is, could they lead more than one group, or should leaders be part of that same bubble of 15, or can they lead more than one group? I guess this goes back to Richard's point about finding people who will volunteer for serving in ministries, that kind of thing.
I think that's a matter of wisdom rather than being specified. From what I've read, the best practice is, as far as possible, to have groups that are stable and unchanging with kind of leaders with the groups. There is recognition, though, that because of staff capacities, it may be necessary for leaders to serve more than one group. But as far as is possible, what you're seeking to do is minimize instability between groups and leaders, but it's not an absolute rule under the guidance as it is at the moment.
Thanks, John. That's great. As I say, we can pick some more of these up afterwards. I'm really sorry if I didn't get to yours. I'm not deliberately ignoring you.
And of course, in coming weeks, as we gather again, there'll be plenty of opportunity for more questions. I'm sure we'll come back to the specifics of the guidance. We want to focus deliberately on youth and children at a subsequent webinar. And the guidance is either changing or constantly being re-understood in the light of circumstances. Who knows what might happen as schools go back and as the situation on the ground changes. But we'll try to give you as accurate and honest understanding of what the guidance is as that becomes available to us. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. It is brilliant to see you again. It's so encouraging to hear all that you're doing to try to enable your churches to keep preaching the gospel, whether online or physically. Please do be assured of our prayers for you. Please do get in touch with us if there's any help you'd specifically want from us. We'd be delighted to talk to you either on the phone or arrange a Zoom meeting to give you whatever help we can. Next Wednesday, Phil Brown from Cow Plain, thinking about how we manage the combination of physical and online services. Let me pray as we finish. Father, we want to thank you for that reminder at the beginning that you are the sovereign God who's in control of all things. Please guard us against the danger of being either arrogant and boastful or fearful. We want to pray that we would have faith in you, our sovereign God, who is working out all things for good. We ask and pray that you give us immense wisdom as we seek to lead our churches and help them to navigate these challenges and to be as effective as possible in their ministry. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.